I'm Anna Hoffman, and welcome to Learn Live. We are super excited to be here today to continue our discussion about Azure SQL. I'm Anna Hoffman, and I'm joined today by Bob Ward. Bob, thanks for joining us again today.
Anna, thank you for having me again. Everybody that's tuning in, we're so excited you're here today, and I cannot wait. We're continuing our journey to talk about Azure SQL, and I'm really excited that today's session is all about deploying configure, so it should be fun.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a great session full of demos and demos that you can get hands-on with yourself. So if you head over to Microsoft Learn either now or later or whenever you're watching this, you're going to find a module dedicated to this topic, which includes all the hands-on exercises you're going to see in demo form today. So it should be really great. You don't have to follow along through the exercises live with us. If you want to, you can. Otherwise, you can try them later. There's also some more resources and more context around certain topics, but we're really excited to be here today. Thanks for joining us. If you have any comments or questions throughout the session, this is live and interactive, so feel free to say hi in the chat. We have subject matter experts from our team standing by to help answer any questions you might have, so be sure to tune in. We're not in the first module of this Azure SQL Fundamentals. We're actually in the second module. Bob, can you tell us a little bit about what we covered last week, what we're covering today, and kind of what else there is to cover?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Last week was all about just introducing our audience community to Azure SQL, especially compared to like what SQL Server is. A lot of people know SQL Server. So what does Azure SQL, what does it mean to them? Remember, we talked about Azure VMs, we talk about managed instances, and Azure SQL databases as a complete suite of services for SQL in the cloud. And so just get everybody familiar with what it is, what your choices are, why would you use it, how are you going to plan for it? But I think today, the right thing to do is to talk about how to set it up. You're used to installing SQL Server, you're configuring SQL Server, you configure databases. So that's a great topic for us to cover today. And then where we're headed in the future is that meat and potatoes of SQL, security, performance, availability, and then a great session to wrap the entire series up on just putting it all together. So you can see where that journey is. We just got you started. What is Azure SQL? To introduce you to the idea. Wasn't a lot of demos last week, but today let's kind of show it off some. And you have to know how to get to deploy this thing to use it in the first place. So are you ready, Anna, for some hyper-focusedness? I can't say that right, but yeah, I think that's where we're headed, right?
I'm not sure I'm ever ready for the hyper-focusedness, but it's definitely always a lot to learn. So I'm looking forward to learning. I think our viewers are looking forward to learning. So let's get right into it. So like Bob mentioned, we're going to start by talking about deploy and configure. So we're going to talk about pre-deployment planning. So what do you do before you deploy? We're going to talk about actually deploying, configuring, verifying, getting connected, loading data. All these things are topics that are going to be covered today over the course of the next 75 minutes. So stay tuned, and here we go. So the first thing you want to think about when we think about pre-deployment planning, so before you just go in and deploy, you need to have some sort of plan. And the biggest decision you have to make up front is, okay, well, is this a new deployment, or is this an existing application or database that we're actually going to migrate? So we don't spend a ton of time in this series talking about migration, but we wanted to take a little bit of time now just to talk about some of the new things in migration and some of the ways we are going to help you from a migration standpoint. So what I really like, and I'll share this resource with you all, we just recently actually revamped the whole site, is we really break down migration into 3 phases. What do you do before you migrate? So pre-migration. What do you do after you migrate? And how do you migrate? And what do you do after you migrate? So before migration, migration, after migration. It's a very simple process, which I like. Now, during the pre-migration phase, what you're going to do is you're going to discover and assess all your existing instances and applications and database and try to figure out, what is going to move, where is it going to move, which deployment option. We talked about them last week, SQL Server and Azure VM, Azure SQL Managed Instance, Azure SQL Database. You're going to use some of those decision points you learned about last week to kind of decide, where is this thing going? What size is it going to? Is hyperscale or serverless something we want to take advantage of? And then if you're not coming from SQL Server to Azure, you might be coming from another type of database. Then you actually have to convert your schema. And we do have tools for this, such as SSMS, And we can provide some resources for that in this link I have coming up on the screen soon. Now, once you figure out, what you're going to migrate, you actually have to do this migration. So if you're doing an online migration, you have to do all of these steps here. If you're doing an offline migration, you really just migrate the schema, the data, and the objects. During that time, you're offline, and then you switch over your connection strings and you're back to up and running. Now, some customers prefer to take maybe a more phased online approach. So they'll migrate, but they'll also maintain some sort of data sync. We have some services and some different options for you to do that. And then when you're ready and you're comfortable to do what we're calling the cutover, so move from your SQL Server on-prem to your, for example, Azure SQL Database, then you can perform that cutover and now you're migrated to moving to the cloud. So you can have a little less downtime. And finally, once you migrate, there's a lot of things that you can do. And a lot of these things are actually going to apply in some of this deploy and configure section. But we talk a lot about remediating your applications, making sure everything works, optimizing not only for performance, but also for price, and just making sure everything works and doing some good testing. And those two resources in the bottom right side of this page are going to be the most useful for you. The first is the Azure Migrate program, where you can basically apply and get free resources, whether it's training, a white glove experience, all sorts of things to help make this migration smoother for you. And then the second one is this new website that we actually just launched that I wanted to mention, called aka.ms/data migration. Now, we used to have another page, but this new page is really interesting because it really cleanly organizes all the options of where you could be coming from and where you're going to, and then gives you a custom guide. And again, this has all been revamped just in the past few weeks, so you can count on all that content being up to date. Now, there were a few things that were new, especially related to Ignite. And Bob, I'd love if you could share some of the new things that we came out with related to Azure Migrate.
Yeah, there's two things that are really important that we launched and just announced at Ignite. One is using the Azure Migrate Center as kind of that really great hub, especially for this discovery and assessment phase, Anna, that you talked about. So one of the things we demonstrated, I know I was part of this discussion and demonstration at Ignite, was a new concept of an appliance, because a lot of people out there have a lot of SQL Server instances, a lot of servers, and they're like, I'm not even sure what all I have that I can need to consider to migrate. So this Discover and Assessment appliance, the preview right now is for VMware systems. You run this thing in a lightweight, secure agent in your environment, does all this type of assessment and discovery of your assets. And here's a really cool thing. It's not just about telling you what you have in your environment, but it gives you recommendations. So for example, we can give you recommendations for some of the things we're going to talk about today. What service tier should you pick? Is managed instance the best option for you, or is it database or VM? And then even cost estimates, which we've had a lot of feedback from customers. What's this going to cost me when I make this move into Azure? So that's one thing, Anna. The new Azure Migrate experience to really help with that discovery and assessment experience. And I'm really excited about the preview we talked about, which you're going to see a lot more in the next coming months, is an inline migration experience from Azure Data Studio. You got a single SQL instance, you'd like to assess that just with some of the things we talked about here, and just inline migrate that right to the cloud. Imagine doing that from a single tool that you're familiar with, connected to your existing SQL server. So both those things, we're going to continue and iterate those over the next several months. And I'm kind of excited. I'm also part of the process to produce some content and work with the team on that. So I'm really excited to see how that journey goes forward to help you do all of these phases that Anna, you've talked about today.
Definitely. Thanks, Bob. Really appreciate you chiming in. And I know you're a part of a big demo at Ignite, so it's always interesting to hear your perspective. So we're kind of talking about this pre-deployment planning. So we're talking about the overall process of migration, but now I want to switch to dive in a little bit deeper into whether or not it is a new or existing migration, the things you need to plan out before you go and deploy this. Now, the first thing you might plan out is how you're going to deploy. So Bob talked in the last session about some of the different interfaces you have to interact with Azure SQL, and the same goes for deployment. So for example, you could use the Azure portal. Now, if you're more into scripting, you can use the Azure CLI, you can use Azure PowerShell. To a certain extent, you can even use existing tools like SSMS and Azure Data Studio. So you need to decide, like, how are you going to deploy this thing? Maybe you're going to use ARM templates, maybe you're a big ARM person. And then once you decide how you're going to deploy, again, you should already have an idea of what you're going to deploy before you, open up the Azure CLI or the Azure Cloud Shell and start deploying. So again, just to review briefly, some of the options we talked about were single databases and elastic pools. And we talked about managed instances and instance pools. And I do want to also call out that for this deployment process, we're going to specifically be diving into the platform as a service offering. So we're not going to be talking about SQL Server and Azure VM here. So you're going to pick your deployment option, and then you're going to pick your region. Bob talked about in the last session how we have many different regions all around the world for you to choose from. So you need to make sure, you're picking the one that's going to be closest to where you are, and also ideally in the same region as your application, because you want to reduce that latency as much as you can. Then we talked about this last week as well. You need to pick the purchasing model. So again, for Azure SQL Managed Instance, this is an easy choice because your only option is the vCore model. But for Azure SQL Database, you're going to have the option of choosing between the DTU model and the vCore model. And once you pick that, you're going to pick a service tier. Now, these are the service tiers available for the vCore model, which was the service tier
choices you see in front of us. So if you think about today when you're deploying and configuring SQL Server, you're doing that in your own bare metal or VM environment, and you're making some of these choices yourself as you deploy. You figure out how many cores you need, you pick a certain hardware platform you might be using for your server, or you may pick other choices that affect capacity or predictable performance. So service level objective, as it turns out, and you're going to see it exposed this way, is going to be this combination of these choices. So for example, Azure Database with a vCore model, general purpose, Gen 5, 8 vCores. Something like that together could be called a service level objective. And Anna, one of the things important that you understand about that term is it can affect resource limits that you don't explicitly choose. So for example, today with SQL Server, when you do it on a virtual machine, you pick a certain amount of memory you're going to give that virtual machine. Well, in platforms as a service, the choices you make in your slow affect how much memory you get. You need more memory? Sometimes what we need to go to a different service tier or add more vCores to your deployment to get more memory. Things like maximum transaction log size or transaction log rate, also the same type of concept, depending on your deployment option, database or managed instance, depending on the service tier, how many vCores, it can affect what you're going to get. Things like IOPS. Remember, in platform as a service, we own the infrastructure, including all the drives and the disk storage. So you're not even provisioning disks. So data IOPS can become a factor now based on these choices. Turns out there are some scenarios where the number of files, we'll talk about some of that, I think, more in the performance section, but the number of files you pick could actually have an impact on IOPS. But you normally are determining IOPS based on the storage you've selected in your environment. For us, you need to be using a particular slow to get a certain number of IOPS. But even things like the size of temp DB, max concurrent workers, and even the backup retention choices you may get, all of those together, you're not explicitly picking a lot of these choices that you get for these maximums. It's the slow you pick that dictate these limits. And Anna, here's the good news. You might look at this list and go, well, how am I going to go figure all this out? Which one is which? There's a couple of interesting things. Number one, the documentation has some really excellent tables where you go choose the different options you want, the service tier, the deployment option, the hardware generation, and we'll tell you what those maximums look like. And then also, we're going to show you today and in future modules, dynamic management views that also give you that same type of information depending on the choices you've made. So it's important to understand the choices Anna showed you already, but also implicitly, what does it mean when you make those choices? You know, what kind of resources and predictable performance do I get from platform as a service?
Yeah, it's a great call out, Bob. And, you know, we have a lot of people, at least I do, and I'm sure you do as well, just reaching out and trying to understand this. And then you show them that table and the documentation, and they're like, oh, it makes so much sense. This is how much IOPS I need. This is how much, you know, I need of this other thing. And I can very easily figure out which flow is going to be the best for me. So it's really useful. You know, Bob, I don't know if maybe we have some people that didn't join us last week, but we love to do knowledge checks, right?
You mean you love to do knowledge checks? Let's be clear about this, Professor Hoffman. Yeah, you're the one that loves to stump people, including me.
Yes, I mean, I try my best. I wouldn't say I could ever stump you, Bob, but I do try my best. And so we're going to continue the knowledge checks here. If you want to participate in giving your answer, just feel free to add it in the chat, or if you're streaming through us with Learn TV, that's going to be the best because you can actually fill out the poll and we can get a look at all the different answers that you have. But this first question is, which of the following options have limits depending on your deployment option and service tier? So this is a little bit tricky. You had to have been paying attention to what Bob was saying to try to figure out which of the following kind of depend on the deployment option and service tier. So I'm going to give you guys a few seconds to bring in your questions. Bob, what do you think? Do you think people are going to be able to tackle this one?
I think so. I mean, we did just talk about it. I mean, we had a bunch of bullet points, right? And so it may have been blurry to you to think about this. But again, I want to just emphasize that you make choices on managed instance database, you pick general purpose, business critical, you pick a generation hardware, and you pick things like vCores. There are some things you don't choose about what is possible for you. And so this question is all about what are the limits or things that are going to potentially happen to you based on your choices. And then the reason I wanted this to be a big part of this is I want people to start getting in that mindset as they're planning. I want them to be able to make the right choices so they're not surprised. So that they come along and deploy Azure SQL Database or managed instance and go, oh, wait a minute, my maximum transaction log size is not big enough for my application. And I want them to understand, to be able to go research that to give them a great experience.
Definitely. Thanks, Bob. It looks like we are getting some answers coming in. Looks like so far there's a very strong leader. I'm not sure if you can see the answer before you post the answer, but go ahead and get your answers in. It looks like 85% of people are saying all of the above. So you do have about 15% of people that are saying something else. But a good number of people think it's all of the above. Bob, why don't you take us through it?
Well, if you tuned in last week, it's okay if you didn't. But I told Anna that I like to take multiple choice tests by process of elimination. It's a quick way to get through an exam and to give you more confidence in your answers. So if I look at this right here, I know that size of temp DB is something I just talked about, right? I mean, that is a limit that will be a factor of your deployment option and service tier. So is max log size. Okay, so since size of 10D and max log size are both correct, it can't be one of the two because they're both correct, and it can't be C because they're both correct, so it's got to be D. As it turns out, backup retention, even though you choose a backup retention, your choices on backup retention of what you get access to are based on your options and service tier. So the answer's got to be D.
Awesome, thanks, Bob. This one was a little bit tricky for some people, but I think most people got it, so that's good. If you got the question wrong or you didn't get to answer the question before we went over the solution, don't worry. I think we have like 4 or 5 more knowledge checks throughout, so there'll definitely be more questions, more opportunities for you to take a shot at answering.
More tests. So good job, Anna. More tests. Great.
More tests. So we talked about pre-deployment planning, and the next thing to talk about makes sense, is to talk about actually deploying. So what I put up here on the screen is all the different blades that you would see if you went into the Azure portal and try to deploy an Azure SQL managed instance or an Azure SQL database. And you can see that some things are designated DB because they're only related to deploying database only, and some things are designated MI. But that doesn't mean that they're not available. It just means they're not necessarily configurable during deployment. Some of these things you have to configure after deployment. And instead of going through these individually, I thought it would be a little more interesting to take a look at a demo. But before we get into it, there is one new thing here, like very new, and that is maintenance windows. Bob, can you tell folks a little bit about maintenance windows?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. I think one thing is great about this, though, it just shows, Anna, how both of us have tried to make sure, we've been doing this for a while, right? We're trying to adapt of what's changing and what's new in the cloud to make sure when we present things like this, you get the latest and greatest information. So we've worked very hard for that. Maintenance windows is a good example of that. So you've deployed platform as a service with us, and you're like, great, this is awesome. I've got this all set up. You talked about SLAs and high availability. We're going to talk about that in future modules, but we mentioned it in the last discussion. But then you might be saying like, hey, this is a versionless SQL server. You talked about that last time. When do you guys update things in the background, and how do I know about them? And is it going to affect my application? So as it turns out, Anna, what people don't know is prior to this point, we do the best we can to make sure that we, by default, only do updates in the evening. So like during normal working hours, like 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., depending on what region you deployed, local, that time zone, we try not to do any kind of maintenance activities on updating SQL or the Fabric or Windows or whatever, right? And that's what's called a maintenance window. So we've been doing this the entire time. We just didn't really document that. And so when you see this option, your system default is going to be that. But the feedback from customers was, I'd like a different window. How about you only do it on the weekends? That'd be kind of cool during a different time frame. So Anna, you're going to show this in the demo you're doing, but we just announced this concept. It's a more predictable time frame of when we're going to maintain your deployment of Azure SQL or managed instance, so you can account for that. Another thing that's really cool, you're going to discover as you dive into this, you're going to have the ability to get alerts or notifications when these events are occurring. That's going to help you have a more predictable experience to decide, when am I affected? The service level agreement is not affected by this. And it does not take into account things like unexpected failures that might occur because of hardware reasons or something in the infrastructure. But for maintenance activities, again, why it's called maintenance window, we're going to give you choices now on what is that window of time that we're going to take things offline for a short period of time to make sure we keep things up to date in platform as a service.
Awesome. Thanks, Bob. So I think without further ado, let's take a look. Let's take a look at some demos. Let's get hands-on. So here I am in the Azure portal. You see a lot of things here, but what I want to show you is a few things. So first, if I type Azure SQL up here, you're going to see a lot of different things. So I just wanted to help you navigate this blade. Now on this first blade under services, you're going to be able to filter all your services. So if I select Azure SQL, you might remember from the end of the last session, I actually showed you this. It shows you all of your Azure SQL deployments, so existing deployments. That's what you're going to get here. Now over here, what you can see is the marketplace. So this is where you can go if you want to deploy something new. So in this case, we want to deploy a new Azure SQL database. So that's where we would want to start. But you can also see some other options here, like documentation that might be related. If I had resource groups that had Azure SQL in the name, they would show up here. And you can also see some other resources, in this case, a solution, which I have deployed related to Azure SQL. So this is a really great way to just search everything in Azure, whether it's documentation, your existing deployments, or new deployments. So we're going to go ahead and select Azure SQL. And we're going to get this familiar blade. I showed you guys this last week. But what we're going to do is we're going to deploy a single database here. And you see, we are getting a little what to use when here down at the bottom. And so what we're going to do is just a single database this time now. So I'm going to go ahead and click create. And now I'm going to have to locate my resource group. So here's one of my resource groups. So you're going to select your subscription, your resource group, and then you have to give your database a name. I'm going to call it AdventureWorks, and it'll make sense shortly why I do that. And now we haven't talked a ton about this. I know Bob will go into this in more detail after this, but with Azure SQL Database, you have this idea of an Azure SQL Database logical server. So this isn't a full SQL server like you would expect in SQL Server on-prem, for example, or SQL Server in Azure Virtual Machine. But really, this is more of a logical server that's going to allow you to group databases and policies together. And it's also going to give you something to connect to, right? Because you have to connect to some sort of server. So I'm going to click Create New. I'm going to give this a name. Let's call it 1, 2, 3, 4. See if that's available. Oh, 5, 6. Really creative there. Give it a server admin login. So this is going to be very similar to like your sysadmin login. I think we talked about this in the last session, but you have to deploy with a SQL auth login. I think that's actually something we'll talk about next week. Then you want to give it a password, and we'll see how I do typing live. It's like, okay, you pick the region. So we talked about the different regions you might select. You hit OK. Okay, we're going to select a different region. Use East US 2. And then once all that's validated, you can choose, do you want to use a SQL Elastic Pool? In this case, we're going to say no. And you also have the option to come in here and configure the service tier and all the details related to that. So for example, if we take a look at general purpose, I now have the option of choosing between provision or serverless compute. I also have the option to change the hardware configuration. I'm just going to leave it as the default. We're going to use provision for now. And I get to pick the vCores and the data max size. So these are all things that Bob mentioned. Your selections here are going to have an impact on several different things. So I'm just going to leave all the defaults for now, and I'm going to go into the next blade, which is networking. We're going to talk a lot more about networking in the security module, but for now, when you deploy, you do have to make some decisions. So you kind of have to know a little bit. The default is no access, and if you're just getting started with this thing or just trying to get access to it, I do not recommend using the no access. I recommend using the public endpoint. This is just going to be the easiest way for you to get connected and for other apps to connect to it. Now, that being said, if you're looking for the most secure way, and again, we're going to talk about this much more in the security module, then you can actually configure with a private endpoint. So I'm going to select public endpoint, and I'm going to say, okay, any Azure service can connect to this, and also add my current IP address. So this is a virtual machine that I'm in, and I'm basically saying, yeah, go ahead and add this as a firewall rule so that I can connect from this machine. It's just the easiest way to get connected. Now, in additional settings, I have some options around data source. So I can choose none. I can use an existing backup from anywhere else in my subscription, or I can also use a sample. Now, if I use the data source of none, let's say I'm starting a new application, I want to set all this thing up, I have the option to configure this collation only on the server level and only during deployment. So this is the only time you really have to make any changes here for Azure SQL Database. It is a little bit different for Azure SQL Managed Instance. Then you can also configure Azure Defender for SQL. So this is something, again, we'll talk about a lot more detail in the security module. For now, I'm just going to start the free trial of it. And then finally, Bob talked about maintenance windows. And we can see by default, that's going to happen between 5 p.m. and 8 a.m. local time to me. But I also have some options here to change it to Monday to Thursday at night or Friday to Sunday at night. So maybe depending on when my application is heavily used, I might pick one versus the other or stick with the system default. Now, next, I'm able to add some tags. So for example, you might keep track of your resources by using something like environment and then calling this your dev environment. Then you can review and create and go ahead and kick off that resource. So this is just a simple way of deploying a database. I've actually already deployed this database for some of our other examples later on, and next we'll talk about some of the details as well as later how to verify and configure this thing.
Yeah, one of the things I want to emphasize before we talk about this next slide is I always use the portal experience well to kind of show off what I'm doing in Azure. But we mentioned this a little bit last week. You have the same abilities to make all those choices Anna did through a CLI. You can do this through AzCLI, you can do it through PowerShell, and then take a hard look at something called Azure templates to automate, especially like a mass deployment if they need to do something like that, right? Okay, Anna, so we were building this course out and, we were talking about deploy, configure, and I'm like, Anna, we didn't really tell anybody like how we do this. And you're like, what do you mean? And I said, well, I think it'd be kind of interesting to know a little bit more, even though things can change over time. Like, how do we deploy an instance or a database or hyperscale, like some of the stuff behind the covers? We alluded a little bit into it when we talked about the history and so forth, but we do have something called the service fabric in Azure that helps us as developers deploy our services within Azure. All services in Azure use the service fabric to deploy. And in fact, you yourself can go to build your own service fabric app as a service using Azure if you choose. So it all starts with managed instance. Like, what are some of the things behind the scenes that affect how you see these deployment? So first of all, in managed instance, we have something called a dedicated ring or virtual cluster. And this gives us that VNet isolation that we talked about last time to describe what managed instance is. The only downside to that is because of that, the deployment or scale operations can take a little longer than doing an Azure SQL database where it's not a dedicated ring. Because you're just doing a database, we don't have to necessarily do that. Today, the way we deploy managed instance is that an instance of SQL Server, it's actual SQL Server instance, is deployed in its own VM. And depending on how we organize things in the cluster and how the choices you make, there could be multiple VMs per node within this cluster. What is a reason is why we built pools. We talked about instance pools last week, is we can then start combining multiple instances now in a VM to make deployment a lot faster and give you a lot more density and open up things like lower core type options. So this is what a managed instance looks like, but it still does use the service fabric, both in general purpose and in business critical, as an underlying infrastructure to run the cluster and run SQL Server. Now, what about Azure SQL Database? So Anna, I'm glad you brought up that logical server concept, because I have to admit it confuses so many people that are SQL Server people, because you deploy a SQL Server that has what? A physical master database, a model database like system databases, and then your user databases. So an Azure database, like you just said, you're giving me a database. What is this logical server? Think of this as a collection of metadata that we are doing. It may not be an actual SQL server. We're using a set of resources as a connection point for you. Anna, you mentioned last time the concept like a gateway, right? And we're going to talk more about that. So think in terms of this logical server giving you access to like this gateway, plus storing information about the databases that are associated with the server itself. And it turns out there's a logical master database that kind of looks like a master that's part of this concept. Now, I mentioned this a little bit already in the history of this but to emphasize to you, it's not a for sure thing, but we use a dedicated SQL instance behind the scenes for each of these databases. There's a few exceptions to that, but for the most part, each Azure database gets its own SQL instance. But here's the confusing part. You don't see the SQL instance, the physical master. We manage all that for you. You, though, at the logical server level, will see this logical master. It can get somewhat confusing when you start going into things and using SQL Server, but it can explain why, for example, Anna, the use command doesn't work. So you're going to connect to Management Studio or Azure Data Studio, and you're going to go, oh, use AdventureWorks. I'm just going to say, sorry, we don't know how to do a use. That's because, again, these databases may not be on the same SQL instances. So how do you use across multiple computers? The SQL engine doesn't know how to do that. That explains why use doesn't actually work. It's okay. You have the ability to connect to anything and explicitly say, what database I want to connect to. Now, because we're doing a dedicated SQL instance, though, it's very powerful because it gives you more surface instance level type diagnostics. You're going to see that throughout our presentations and all the different modules we're doing. What about this hyperscale thing that is really popular? I love the name, right? It's incredibly impressive technology. And you're going to see a lot more information behind the scenes when we talk about availability, about what we built. But because we built a unique architecture using SQL Server, you cannot change today the tier once you go that way. So if you go to hyperscale with Azure SQL Database as a service tier, remember you get general purpose, business critical, hyperscale. You cannot go back to general purpose and business critical. When you go to general purpose and business critical, you can switch between them. We can actually set up that kind of type scenario. But once you move to hyperscale, you cannot move back, at least today. And we'll see in the high availability section, we're going to use a very impressive set of caches, which is a distributed tiered architecture to provide speed and scale. And then something really interesting, we're going to use remote storage for the databases, still use the caches for speed, but we're going to allow some very interesting scenarios like snapshot backup. So point in time restore becomes really crazy fast. Now, Anna, you may not be aware of this, but behind the scenes, we're doing some resource governance in both managed instances and Azure Database to give this slow and predictable performance. So we introduced this feature several releases of SQL Server ago called Resource Governor. And we're going to take advantage of that in Azure SQL behind the scenes in the engine, but we're going to add some functionality to Resource Governor that you don't see in SQL Server to do things like enforcing transaction log rates. But we're going to use other things like Windows job objects. I'm going to show you an example in a second how Windows job objects can affect your SQL deployment. We're going to use things like file server, Azure storage limits, things of that nature to help provide all those different slow limits I talked about, depending on what you choose, to ensure we give predictable performance and we give you what we say we do based on the tables we actually talked about. So there's your hyper-focusedness slide of the day to give, and you know, Anna, we could change some of this. You know, we reserve the right behind the scenes as platform or service to change some of these things, but this is effectively how we make things work today behind the scenes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely useful to kind of get a glance under the hood, and it helps you understand how certain things work. Like, for example, I think a great example is how you can't use that use statement because now you understand that running underneath, you might have a full SQL instance that isn't the same as your other database. So I think it's really useful, especially for people who really understand how SQL Server works, to understand how we've kind of implemented this thing under the hood.
Well, we were going through this exercise of building. I love the fact that we get these little stories how we were building these things. And I remember this meeting. We specifically had this meeting about our content. And I said, Anna, we got to tell the people how do they verify the deployment. And you go, what are you talking about? I mean, it just works, right? I'm like, yeah, man, I'm sorry. I've been doing SQL Server for so long. Like when I deploy SQL Server, I go through a verification process to do a sanity check of did this work? So maybe we should talk about my viewpoint of verifying deployment, compare that to Azure SQL. So let's just kind of go to a progression of how this might look. First of all, it might start with in managed instance, looking at what Anna just showed you, like she did Azure Database. So you can go look at the status of your deployment in the portal or with CLI. So this is a deployment. Remember we talked about in the Azure ecosystem in the first module about Resource Manager. So we're using Resource Manager to do deployment. Deployment is a concept in Azure for all Azure resources. And this deployment has details behind it and something called an activity log. You know, today you might end up be looking at like the event log in Windows or even logging with journals in Linux. So we are going to put in information about the deployment in this thing called an activity log for you to see the details. For example, is an easy way for you to use the portal to look at activity log to see how long did it take to deploy that instance or Azure Database, or if there's a failure, you can get more information behind the scenes of what to do. Now in managed instance, you get access to the error log, the SQL error log, the tried and true text file of SQL Server for a billion years, right? And you can go into the error log and look at a managed instance to see what it actually looks like. You can't do that with Azure SQL Database because we don't give you access to the instance, but with managed instance, you can do it. And so what might you do if you're an existing SQL Server user today? You might pop up Management Studio and just do a connection, and you might run some queries. But to do that connection, you need some basic stuff, right? Like you need to know the network, the name, and connect. And we'll talk about that. What about SQL Database? What does it look like compared to that thing? Hey, it's the same thing. You just don't get access to the error log. But all the same things that you do with managed instance, all same apply. So you want to run these deployment queries, you want to connect with Management Studio, you need to get network access. Anna briefly mentioned that in the first module. We'll talk a lot about those options of the next module, but notice what she did in her portal deployment. Remember, she said to get going kind of up and fast, she gave allow Azure access and she used her client IP address. So for example, Anna, if you were doing in the portal from your own desktop computer and you gave client IP address access, you now could use SSMS on your client computer to go run deployment queries. You would get the name of the logical server, or in the case of managed instance, the name of the instance. That's available once you run the deployment to see what that name looks like. It's kind of like a 4-part name, right, that you would see. You would get that. You have your login because you already said, like in the case of Azure SQL Database, here's my server admin SQL login. And by the way, Anna, in module 3 in security, we're going to talk about options there, like what are your options for those admin options. But you're going to use that server admin SQL login. You're going to go in with Management Studio. You're going to put in the password. You got this name, and you're going to connect. So once you connect, what do you do? Well, here's what I do. when I look at a SQL server. And I'm going to show you the similarities between that and an Azure SQL database. First, I look at version. I'm like, hey man, is the SQL edition I installed and the right version deployed on what I'm doing? In fact, I looked at version all the time with customers to say, tell me exactly the version of SQL you're running. Well, we're going to show you an example in a second. That's a little different when it comes to Azure SQL because we're versionless. So the version actually doesn't really have much of a factor in what you're doing, except for the fact it's showing you you're in Azure. I'm going to look at what do my databases look like. Do I see my system databases? Do I see the objects I'm used to seeing, like system objects? Or if I had a sample database like Anna showed you, do I expect to see the user objects there? And then I might go through a series of system DMVs. I might look to see, are the number of schedulers match up the number of cores I deployed? What about OS things like OS sysinfo? What about the memory I have access to? I might look at something like OS process memory. That's not going to be available in Azure SQL Database, as it turns out, because, again, you don't see that instance, but that is available in managed instance. And then I look at things like DM exec request. Are all the background processes running? Is my own query running? Do I get a sanity check of looking what's running in SQL Server? Now, I might run server property for addition, and we'll show you an example of why that matters between database and instance. But notice the ones in green. The ones in green are new DMVs that are specific to Azure SQL. And I think the best way to look at this is maybe you see an example. Would you like to see one?
Yeah, I would love to.
Okay, let's do that. So I'm going to go and share my screen now, and let's hope technology works. Okay, Anna, let me give a few seconds here for the magic to appear. Let me know when you see it.
Yep, I can see it.
Now, I just said in that screen to use Management Studio, yet that's not what I'm showing you. I'm showing you Azure Data Studio for a very good reason. Number one, I want to point out a couple of things. I actually have the GitHub repo that goes with this same fundamentals course loaded on my laptop. And whoa, that's not what I want to show you. So I'm using Zoom It, and clearly I'm not doing a good job with Zoom It. So I want to show you first, though, this. This is the GitHub repo, and then notice these what are called notebooks. So we're using a T-SQL notebook that we've built to show you off these examples. There's a combination of markdown text and code to show you. But here's the cool thing. I've got the output already run. So in case that there's an issue, I don't have to actually execute each of these commands. So what I love about this, and Anna, you built this, here's a notebook to show you what verification looks like for managed instance. Here's one for SQL Server, and here's one for Azure Database. So you can kind of compare what does this look like between these three different options. So like the last one could be SQL Server like an Azure VM. But let's go through and see what the output looks like. So first of all, I mentioned about add version, and we told you last week about versionless. So look at this thing here for Azure SQL. You see SQL Azure, we just can't help ourselves, Anna. We still got to call it SQL Azure. That's like a holdover from the old days. And then notice this, it says version 12. What are you talking about? I thought we're like way to SQL 19 now and past, right? That's like the same version we've had it there for a while. So here's the bottom line. You can't use version number anymore to look at Azure SQL because it's versionless. And you're asking yourself like, well, how am I supposed to know what version I'm on? It doesn't really matter. The only thing that you're going to see, and we'll talk about this later, is database compat level for your database. So version numbers really don't matter. The fact that you just see that you're running SQL Azure is the really only important thing that comes from add version for me. And again, you can look at these other examples to compare and contrast. What does that look like? Now, server property can matter because if you want to, as a programmer, know what am I actually running. So look at this. You can see here that I'm running Azure SQL Database, which is number 5. Or if I wanted to, I could look at, if I got an 8, I could tell if I'm running managed instance. So this gets really interesting because you're asking yourself, okay, is Azure Database or managed instance that I'm running, is it standard, enterprise, express, or desktop? Like which one is it? Okay, we don't have editions in Azure SQL. We have service tiers like we talked about, and in some cases, that can dictate functionality that may show up. For example, in-memory OLTP only appears in business critical. But for the most part, here's the cool thing, most of this functionality you get from a feature level point, this just comes in your deployments for Azure SQL. One thing that's different today between, like, say, standard and enterprise is limits. And so we already talked about the fact that your deployment choices can affect limits, things like memory. So that's how you look at which edition you're running for Azure SQL. Let's get into some of the output of the DMVs. Now, this is going to surprise a lot of people. For Azure SQL Database, I see a master and I see my database. what happened to model, MSDB, TempDB, all those things? Remember, we abstract you from the instance. So the master you're seeing here is actually the logical master that goes for the logical server. So anytime you run sys databases in your Azure SQL database, you're only going to see your database and the logical master. And if you were to run this in managed instance, you would see the normal system databases because we do give you the entire instance of SQL. Now, sysobjects is going to look pretty much like you're used to seeing in SQL Server. That's kind of reassuring. I see all the system objects I'm used to seeing. So that's good as a sanity check that I see that. Now let's go look at schedulers. Now, this is really an important concept for me personally. I deploy SQL Server on, say, a virtual machine with 8 vCores. I go right into OS schedulers and I'm like, do I get 2 schedulers? Because we normally deploy 2 visible schedulers per the number of cores that you get. And you, in this particular case, I'm running a general purpose 2 vCore option. Therefore, I expect to see 2 schedulers to kind of match, what I deployed. So I'm pretty good there. Let's kind of keep going and seeing, okay, this is where things get a little different. Notice here that we're going to show you 2 DMVs that only show up in Azure SQL Database and Managed Instance. I think I even mentioned in the previous screen that instance resource governance would also show up in just MI. But as it turns out, user DB resource governance can also appear in Managed Instance. And if you get kind of confused on what we're seeing here, when you go look at these notebooks, because you have access to them, and it's going to show you some of the resources at the end of the day that you have access to, we have all sorts of great documentation and our markdown text for what I'm showing you here, though. But what you're going to love about the notebooks is that you can go look at this and compare to your own deployment to see, as kind of a sanity check, what am I having access to? So here we go. I'm going to look at user resource governance here, and that's pretty interesting because I'm going to look at my database. I'm going to scroll along here, and I'm going to see, uh-oh, look at that, Anna, slow name. Here's why we taught you slow. Azure SQL Database, general purpose, Gen 5 hardware, 2 vCore. That's a mouthful, right? But now you can see why slow is this combination of these concepts we're doing. And you're going to see that in other examples where we're going to look at an Azure SQL Database or managed instance deployment. Now, I said I only had 2 vCore, and sure enough, I can say I'm limited to 2 CPUs. Notice this. Also, I can see my max stop possibilities. So it turns out for a 2 vCore general purpose deployment, we only let you have max stop 1. If you need parallelism at a higher level, you got to pick a higher vCore limit, and you'll see how we can configure that DOP. Now, memory is an interesting one because we mentioned about this job object concept, and I show you that here. So how much memory do I really get? As it turns out, for an instance of SQL Server, we want to make sure we apply proper resource limits. So we use this Windows job object concept, which is not a scheduler thing. It's a way to do process limits on Windows processes. So you can see here from Windows job objects, the process memory limit MB, this corresponds to the table we talked about for a general purpose 2 vCore deployment. And that's 10 gig. If you needed more memory of that, and again, that's the same memory you get like in SQL Server for your buffer pool and all your memory needs. If you need more than that, you would bump up your vCore level and you would see those values get higher. Now, the last thing I want to show you is DM exec requests. And people ask like, Bob, why would you run that? Well, I want to make sure that this is really SQL Server. Do you really have a lazy and log writer? Do you really have the background task I'm normally using? And that's why I kind of prove to people, yeah, it really is SQL Server. It's the instance engine running all that stuff you're used to seeing that apply to your environment. So it's just also to show you that DM exec request, which is kind of this instance level thing you want to see, that works for your database. So if you want to go see your own user requests as they're executing, and Anna, we'll show you great examples of that when we go to performance. We'll show you how you're going to use the same DMVs you're used to using today for SQL Server, and in addition, some of these new DMVs you're seeing for Azure to look at things like performance, to look at security, to look at availability. But this is just a sanity check. So SQL Server users that come in to deploy Azure SQL, it gets them in a comfort zone to say, yeah, it kind of feels like a SQL Server.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is really useful. And like you mentioned, I think it's useful for people to compare, how it varies among what they're getting. And also, love to come back to this, how for the most part, it's really just SQL here. We're just changing a little bit of the scope depending on what you deploy.
Absolutely.
Cool. So let me share my screen again, and we're going to do a knowledge check. So This is a good one. So Bob showed you all some verifying deployment queries that he runs. And for this question, they're saying there are some new queries specific to Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance. Now, which of the following queries are only available for Azure SQL? So remember, when I say Azure SQL here, I mean Azure SQL Database and or Azure SQL Managed Instance. So which of these are only going to be available for Azure SQL? So you should see that coming up on your screen to answer from Learn TV. If you're streaming from somewhere else like YouTube or Twitch or Twitter, feel free to put your answers in the chat or head over to Learn TV and we'll make sure we get your answer counted. Bob, you know, when you first went and you deployed and you were doing this analysis of comparing all these things, was there anything that like really stood out to you as far as what you can see or what you can't see?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm a SQL Server person for 28 years. And so I heard about Azure SQL Database and I'm like, oh, well, I probably don't get to see things like DMVs, like OS schedulers. Like, I'm not going to let me see that because it's just a database, right? So when I ran these queries, like I told you about this verification thing, you're like, hey, man, what are you going to do? Why are you doing this? I'm like, I want to make sure it's SQL Server. Like, is there some trick behind the scene? So I ran DMO sort of schedulers, and I'm like, oh, this is what I used to use in SQL Server. So I get to see what I'm used to. DM exec request, this could be the #1 DMV used in the world with SQL Server. Every SQL Server professional knows how to run that thing, right? And so I ran it. I'm like, man, I want to see the processes, the background processes. I mean, what if I have a problem with my deployment and something's going wrong? I want to be use DM exec request to troubleshoot my problem. You know, I was in support for a million years. And if you would have called me in support and said, I'm having a problem with my SQL Server, I'm like, go run that. So I can see the output of that, right? Many people have written stored procedures that, you know, use this and use other DMVs. So what stood out for me was I was so impressed with things that I had access to, even though I still get that abstraction of the database and still predictable performance. And then the second thing that stood out is that, you know, the tables are great, but I'm a programmer. Like, give me access to a query that shows me these details. And I think the thing that's really cool is we're still continuing the tradition of dynamic management views being a way to look at things in tables. And we're just doing it by doing things that look like SQL and things that are new and specific to Azure.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And it's interesting. It's always interesting to hear your perspective because, you know, you've been around and seen this from basically the beginning of SQL.
Yeah.
So looks like we have some answers coming in. We got a few people saying C and D, and a few people, actually most people are saying B. So Bob, do you want to take us through your thought process on how you would go through, you know, your elimination?
Sure, yeah. Well, first of all, I did specifically say that OS process memory is not available in Azure SQL Database, and you called it out here. This is both for database and managed instance. So D has to be eliminated correctly, right? And it has to be eliminated. Mm-hmm. So you said here, which following queries are only available for these two? And I just told you that exec request is something I use in SQL Server all the time. So that can't be the answer either. So it's left with A or B. And then I even mentioned to you that OS schedulers, which I use in SQL Server all the time, is available there. So the only thing that could be possible is this new one, DM user DB resource governance. That was written specifically for cloud deployments of SQL. So B would have to be the answer. Oh, awesome. I was right. Thank goodness.
You sound surprised.
Well, I'm like, okay, does this elimination thing actually going to work on live television, right?
Yeah, you were right, and it looks like about 85% of our viewers were right too. So kudos to you, and kudos to the live viewers tuning in.
Awesome. Yeah, so the next part of our journey after deployment and looking at verification and looking at all the different architectures was configuration. And Anna, you told me in a conversation, like, well, you know, how many options are there? And I'm like, oh, if you only knew. SQL Server, we're famous for allowing you to configure SQL. Now, some things you do during deployment, and you did some of that in the portal, right? And in SQL Server, when you run setup, if you remember, and I remember I had all those screenshots of how SQL setup works and all the different choices you can get. But you also have configuration choices for SQL Server and for databases. So if you think about a managed instance, the #1 thing people do to configure SQL is SP-configure. This stored procedure has been around almost as long as the product's been around. It's a server-wide configuration option. They're knobs to touch things on how SQL behaves and performs. And so, as it turns out for managed instance, you have access to many of the things you do for SQL Server, just like a SQL Server today. The one big limitation here is you cannot restart managed instance on your own. You can fail it over. We'll talk about that during availability, but you don't have like a net start, net stop SQL Server. So any option in configuration that requires a restart is not available to you. There are some trace flags that are available. We document very specific ones you're allowed to touch, but we don't just open up the entire trace flag story here like you do for SQL Server. So if you think you're going to start, going on the internet and finding your favorite trace flag to bring down SQL, sorry, you're kind of a little bit out of luck. And in fact, that's a good thing. We don't really want you to have to use trace flags a lot for SQL Server. There are a few specific things you can do, but we want to limit the need for you to have to do that. Now, temp DB size is interesting. You're not going to get access to actually control that in managed instance like you do in a SQL Server, but you do indirectly. And in fact, we talked about the fact that the different choices you're going to make, right, for your different options are going to affect that size, number of files, that kind of type thing. So indirectly, you're going to be doing things, but you don't directly change the size. You're used to doing that for your SQL Server today. It's a good thing. It's a good thing for you to have less worry about how that works. But we do document what the sizes, the max sizes you get for tempdb based on your choices. And this is a surprising thing to a lot of people, but you can actually configure model and master. It is a system data, a SQL instance. You can go put objects in model, and new databases will pick that up if you need to. Now, the addition of SQL Server, I kind of alluded to that already. You don't pick an addition for managed instance. You pick your service tier. And again, most functionality and features that you do are going to be consistent across general purpose and business critical for managed instance. There's a few small differences there, and we document what that looks like. And then, Anna, you're going to really get into this in Module 3. You're going to make some network configuration choices. You're used to doing in SQL Server like allow TCP and name pipes and some of those kind of things. You don't mess with that stuff anymore. You just only pick your configuration on how to connect into your instance. And then in space management, you're used to doing that with your SQL Server. We'll talk more about that in the next section about how does space management kind of work in an MI. So that's your configuration of managed instance and some of the options that you get. So let's talk about databases now. So for Azure Database and for managed instance, you do have Alter Database. Here's a really cool thing, Anna. In the documentation, I know you've seen this before. You go look at Alter Database in our documentation. We have this really cool layout where you just pick your deployment option, SQL Server, Managed Instance, or Database, and you click it, and we flip and show you the Alter Database reference that applies only to what that looks like. It's very handy to know what's possible and not possible. And so you get to do some file maintenance in managed instance in terms of sizes, number of files, things of that nature. You don't pick storage, though. We'll talk about that in the performance section for a very good reason. But you can pick how many files you get and the sizes of those within your max storage. You do have set options, just like you do in SQL Server, and database compat. That'll be a very important thing that you've seen in SQL Server today. Sometimes that's how you're controlling functionality. You do have access to that in managed instance and database. And Alter Database scope configuration, which is very important, that is also available to you in both options. Now for SQL DB, there's a few differences there on how we do a few things. You do have network configuration space management for Azure Database, which we'll talk about. But notice this list to the right over here. These are the options we're turning on for default use for Azure SQL Database. And in many cases, you cannot change that, like full recovery. You have to have a full recovery database. In order for us to meet service level agreements, you have to be in full recovery. What about accelerated database recovery? We'll talk about that during the availability section, but that is on by default, and you cannot turn that off. That's because we need that to help you meet that service level agreement. So the last thing in configuration, Anna, that I think it'd be important to tell our audience here is that what are some restrictions of things maybe that you might be used to doing, especially when it comes to things like server configuration manager, that you cannot do with managed instance or database? Now, look at this list for a second here. It's not because we wanted to limit you from doing this. It doesn't make sense in platform as a service. Letting you just restart servers at random, we can't meet a service level agreement if you do that. Worrying about things like instant file initialization or locked pages in memory, even though we might use it, let's abstract you from having to worry about that stuff anymore. Or even when it comes down to things like error reporting and feedback or alter server configurations, we're doing the infrastructure. You're not going to go pick NUMA nodes anymore or even affinity for processors. So a lot of these things that you do right here, you don't need to do. Now, even mixed mode security is forced. That's even changed. We're going to talk about in the security module next week that we have this new option now where even you don't have to have mixed mode security that's forced for you. So again, I did this as a very exhaustive study of comparing SQL Server to Azure SQL, and a lot of these things are usually done outside the engine, Alter Server configuration being one example that's not. But these are things that we don't feel like you have to worry about anymore, like startup parameters, because again, it's platform as a service.
Yeah, and Bob, this is all super, super great information. I know people are starting to see the hyper-focusedness coming out, which is good. We have some people asking questions about the replay of this. I'm guessing their brain is starting to melt, and they're like, I need to be able to watch this again. We did get a question from John Michael, who was one of the people who asked. He said, where can I watch the replays for this? While we are streaming live, all of these are going to be recorded. Well, they are being recorded, and you can find them on, I believe, Channel 9 at aka.ms/learnlive. So there's the link at the bottom of the screen. So don't worry if you missed something or you want to go back and say, wait, what was it that Bob said about IFI? Then you can go back and watch it in the recording, and you can also check it out in the learning path, which we'll share, again, all these resources again at the end. But just wanted to throw that in there, give people's brains a second of relief before we talk about space management. Brain
melting? What? Yeah, I mean, isn't that part of our job? No, actually, it's just thoroughness. Let's be honest, Anna. This is just being thorough. And again, we're trying to get you comfortable with this. You're a SQL Server person, and you think this Azure SQL thing is just this mysterious deal. It's not. It's SQL Server. So trying to get you comfortable about what you can and can't do and why you can't do it. Now, space management, this is an interesting one. I have maybe iterated this slide, Anna, like 5 times because it's a little bit hard to describe this. If you think about today with your SQL Server, with space management, you provide all the storage. You set up the disk drives, you place files and databases in certain disk drives and storage facilities. So you know the maximum capacities of your storage and what you can do when and without those. Since we're platform as a service, we kind of need to explain a little bit how this works. So for Azure SQL Managed Instance, your slow determines the maximum possible size you get to play with for everything, for the system databases, for the user databases. So what's going to happen is, though, we're going to charge you for the storage you're going to use at a maximum level. I know that sounds crazy. So you get this maximum possible size, then you choose the max storage for the instance up to that size. Your maximum possible size, for example, in general purpose is 8 terabytes. You may say, I don't want to pay for 8 terabytes because I'm not using 8 terabytes. So I will put my max storage at 4 terabytes. And then that is the storage you're going to get for the entire instance. Now, database is going to be created as model with default sizes, and I document those there. And you can alter these sizes and files within all this max storage if you'd like. But again, not the physical location. That's something that we manage behind the scenes for you. And during the performance section, we'll talk about the fact that it really doesn't matter that you get to do that. But from a storage perspective, it does, because again, we control the max storage that's possible for you. Now, a couple of things that are interesting I thought might point out here and that I've observed. Number one, message 1105 is one of the oldest messages in the history of SQL Server, because that means you're out of space for your database. But notice this new one, 1133. So since this is the max size of all the storage, it is possible to hit that error before you run out of your database. Because again, it's for the storage for the entire instance. So it's a new error that applications and administration need to be aware of, that if you see this and you're not used to it, it's because you've hit that max size of what you've configured. So you said 4 terabytes. If you hit that limit, you're going to get this error. Now, again, with general purpose, you get up to 8, so you can increase your size that you want up to that limit itself. Now, for general purpose service tier, where databases are stored in Azure storage, as it turns out, the number of files and the size, since we're using Azure storage, it can affect the actual premium storage level that we're using. So we have a really nice blog post that talks about how you might be able to tweak your performance versus using a slow by changing the way you actually apportion data and log files. So that's Azure SQL Managed Instance. Okay, what about this Azure SQL Database where you don't even get access to the instance? The same concept exists. The slow determines the maximum possible size, okay? And then you choose a data max size within that possible size. Now, as it turns out, when you're looking at things like sys.database files, in managed instance, it's going to look just like you're used to. You see the files, you can add some and so forth. For Azure SQL Database, you're not choosing files. So you may see one or more files that may not reflect that exact size. I've seen people go look at the sys database files max size column, and they deployed an Azure SQL Database, but the max size isn't that yet. That's because we may grow that up to that max size if necessary. Now, the transaction log's a different thing. We account for this separately. You pay for data max size, you get, as part of that payment, 30% of that as your maximum transaction log size for your database. Now, we believe it's enough because logs are truncated regularly. We'll talk about that during availability, and we use accelerated database recovery, so you're not beholden to open transactions, accelerating and growing that transaction log. So hyperscale is interesting. One of the things I love about it is not only just it's unlimited storage, but you don't pick a max size. You just pay for the storage you use. In fact, we decide what that looks like. So when Anna showed you those portal options for picking different things like cores and sizes, for hyperscale, you don't even get a storage choice there because we just start building a database and growing to the needs that you need for your unlimited storage. So there is kind of an exhaustive look of how space looks like, but it's important to administrators to understand, how do I play in here in the PaaS space depending on, or compared to how I'm used to doing things in SQL Server.
Yeah, it's definitely super interesting to learn about this, and it's also very important for folks to learn about this. And I think, Bob, you mentioned this. We kind of have redone that previous slide a few times because we want to make sure it's clear. And it seems like no matter how many times we explain it, sometimes it's confusing. And so I think a good way to kind of try to learn is to take an example and try to apply it yourself. So in this scenario, we're going to say if your data max size in Azure SQL Database is set to 10 gigabytes, then what additional space is the maximum transaction log size? So some keywords in there. What additional space? So this is on top of the 10 gigabytes that you already have. So want to call that out there. We should have put the poll up. We'll see. Go ahead and get your answers in. We'd love to see what you guys think and hopefully re-explain if we've confused anyone.
This is important. I think the poll is important because I don't want anybody today tuning in to go deploy Azure SQL Database or even managed instance and have a bad experience from a space perspective. I want them to understand exactly how it works, what's possible. And because, again, anytime you have a bad experience like that, you're just wasting your time. You have energy, you have a bad experience, and you don't feel comfortable with the environment. We want you to have the knowledge so you feel comfortable deploying SQL in the cloud.
Yeah, definitely. It looks like our answers are starting to kind of pour in, so we can go ahead and take a look at this. But I will say it looks like right now, at least, option B is winning by a large majority. There's a few people that have said A, but for the most part, B is in the lead. Okay,
cool. Do you want us to go through it, or you want to give a few more?
Let's go ahead and go through it.
Okay, well, it's process of elimination again. Now, one thing is interesting for anybody who's hyper-focusedness, they're like, hey, what about hyperscale? Well, notice we just said you don't specify a max size with hyperscale, right? So therefore, hyperscale can't be part of this answer. It must be a general purpose or business critical database, Anna, because you don't specify a max size with hyperscale. So in case anybody wants to trap us, they can't do that. Okay, so you pick your data max size. And notice we said data max size. That's actually a term that you do with Azure SQL Database. You pick 10 gig, and what's the additional space for the transaction log? So it can't be 10 gig. You don't get the same amount of log that you get with database. So we can eliminate that one. It's not 50%. I had a very specific thing that I said, and it can't be 1 because that would be 10%. So it's got to be B because that's 30% approximately of the database size of the data max size. So. Yeah,
and I will say it looks like 87% of people got that. So I think most people got it. To those of you that said 1, just a quick recap, the size was 30% accounted separately of the data max size. So that's how we got from the 10 gigs to the 3 gigs. Awesome. Okay, so now we've talked about configuring for space management. One thing we wanted to touch on is configuring for connectivity. Now, Bob mentioned earlier, once you do this thing, what you're going to do is you're going to get the network, you're going to get the name, and then you're going to connect. Now, there's two main ways that you can actually go about this connection. And so let's take a look at one example first. Now, for this, I'm going to talk about proxy, and then I'll talk about another option, and then I'll talk about the default. So in this case, we're looking at an Azure SQL Database logical server. However, this also applies to Azure SQL Managed Instance. We're just showing it in Azure SQL Database right now. Now, if we say we want to use the proxy method of connection, what's going to happen is we're going to go to the gateway. So you can see there's a set of gateways here. We're going to go through the gateway, confirm that we have access. We're going to then get rerouted to the database we want to connect to. So that's the proxy method. Now, one of the potential downsides of this method is that every time you want to connect to the database, you have to go to the gateway first. So you almost have to make an extra hop in the sense before you can get to a database. Now, the other option that we have available is called redirect. Now, in redirect, it's kind of a two-step process. So at first, we go to the gateways and we get the connection information for the database, and then we redirect you straight to the database. So that means the first time you go to the gateway, but every time after that, you're not having to go to the gateway every time. So what this means is it means less hops or less network latency because you're not going to that gateway every single time. So the general recommendation is if you can use redirect, but if you can't, then you can use proxy. And if we think about what the default is and explain why, in Azure SQL, what we do by default is we use redirect for within Azure, so services within Azure. And the reason we can do this by default is this requires a certain number of ports, certain ports to be open, those 11000, 11999, those ports have to be open in order for redirect to work. So we can't make that assumption for your on-premises or outside of Azure environment, but we can make that assumption because we know that it's true for services within Azure. So by default, you're going to get redirect for in Azure, and outside of Azure, you're going to get proxy because we're not going to make that assumption. If you want to use redirect for both, then you'll have to configure this port to be allowed in your on-premises network or from whatever network you're going to be connecting from. Then you can set them both to be redirect. But by default, it's going to be redirect for in Azure and proxy for outside of Azure. And in the exercises, I'll go ahead and put up this next question, but in the exercises that you do, you'll actually go through this exercise to see what that performance difference really looks like. And in some of my tests, it's almost 50%, sometimes more, is decreased in the network latency just because you're making half as many hops. So this can be really useful. Again, your mileage will vary depending on where you are, where your two devices are, where the database is. But it's something to keep in mind. It's a good test to kind of see the differences, if there actually are impactful differences, and also to understand those defaults. And this question is really just asking about the defaults. Hopefully this is an easy one. And next week we're going to talk a lot more about networking, right, Bob?
Yeah, I just want to make sure the audience, we want you to end proxy and redirect, okay? Because it can have impact on performance, especially what Anna just talked about, right? But I want you to be rest assured, next week when we talk about security, Anna's going to go through a really great exercise of explaining the different networking options you have for these deployments, but do it in such a way you don't feel like you're a network guru. This is one of the biggest things we struggle with, is like, how do we explain networking to people that generally don't deal with networking? And we don't. So we're like, okay, we're not networking people. How would we do it ourselves? How would we want to learn it? So next week, you're going to hear a really good description of all those different options you have to connect in and outside of Azure. But proxy and redirect are important. It's important to know that because a lot of people may pick a default policy and they'll look at performance and not understand why there might be a performance issue.
Awesome. Thanks, Bob. I think just for the sake of time, we've given people some time to answer. We've got mostly D's and then a few A's and C's. Bob, you want to take a stab at this one?
Yeah, let's just go right at it and say that A and B cannot be the answer because you just said there's a difference depending on where you are. So we've got to limit A and B. And then it just comes down to C and D. And again, proxy, just remember, you go to the gateway, then you go to your server every time. So because those ports have to be known, proxy can't be proxy does not make sense to be within Azure, because within Azure we just know the ports, right? So D is the only choice really that kind of makes sense for the difference there.
Awesome. Thanks, Bob. That is right. Now, the last main topic we want to talk about is loading data. And I think overall, the big theme that we want to stress is that it's just SQL. So a lot of the things that you did in SQL Server are very similar to what you can do in Azure SQL. However, there are some new options and there are a few limitations that you might want to be aware of. So bulk copy or BCP is something that's very popular for moving data. This is available and supported just like it is in SQL Server. We also have this thing called smart bulk copy. It's been documented by some of our PM teams. We have a few blogs as well we can point you to really help in moving data efficiently. We also have this idea of bulk insert, which is something I think you've all probably used before. The main difference here is that usually you go from a file, and in this case, you're actually going to link it to something like an Azure Blob storage, and you'll see an example of that in a moment. But all the things you know about making bulk inserts perform well are going to apply here. Now, when we think about SSIS, something you might be using a lot today in your on-prem world, you can also use the Azure equivalent of this. We have Azure SSIS available. We also have Azure Data Factory, which is a really awesome tool. If you all haven't played with it yet, it's very useful for doing things that you would previously do on-prem, perhaps with SSIS using Azure Data Factory. We also have Spark connectors, and we'll link to a few blogs in the actual module where we've shown it can be actually very efficient to load data into Azure SQL Database using these Spark connectors. You also have the ability to make a copy of your existing databases. For Azure SQL Database, I did want to call out that you cannot natively restore like you did in SQL Server, but you can import a backpack into Azure SQL Database. And in Managed Instance, you can natively restore a database. However, you're going to do it from a URL instead of from a file, similarly to how you might bulk insert, because you don't have access to the file systems where the managed instance is residing. So that's just a few things that I thought of. Bob, I know you have lots of tips on how to load data efficiently into Azure SQL.
Yeah, one of the things that we've just seen with customers is specifically also when you get large amounts of data, get your files into Azure storage natively. There's all sorts of great ways to do that very, very efficiently, and then go do your loading within there. So load your files up into Azure storage, and then go use something like a Spark, could be running in a VM or something like that, or do a bulk insert where the server's actually accessing the data. So get your files there, and then use the native services in the cloud to go then pull that data in. And again, we mentioned a little bit briefly here that recovery model for SQL Server has to be full recovery. This is why minimum logging is not supported with Azure SQL Database or Managed Instance, except in TempDB. But of course, if you get in TempDB, you still have to move that from TempDB into your actual databases. And then one thing that might get you, I mentioned about transaction log rates as a resource limit. You're going to see more of that in the performance module that we're going to do in a couple of weeks. But bulk operations could be affected by this log rate governance. So you might find yourself needing to change your slow a little bit to give you higher transaction log rates, even for a small period of time to do bulk operations, then move it back if necessary. And then people forget about just some tried and true best practices about using batch sizing for bulk copies, and especially the fact that if you're using column store indexes, it is really a great mechanism to high-speed load large amount of data directly into the cluster column store index itself.
Awesome. Thanks, Bob. And I thought, it might be nice as we kind of round out this module to take a look at some demos. So the first demo is around loading data into Azure SQL using that idea of a bulk insert. Now, I wanted to use this because I wanted to show you all how cool this interface is that you have through Microsoft Learn. So this is the module that we're in, and I just skipped ahead to Unit 8 of 9. You can see I already have a sandbox activated. These are good for 4 hours, so I have some time remaining. Let me just make sure this terminal is still active. Looks like it's not. So I'm going to refresh this terminal. But one of the really great things about this sandbox is you actually have the ability to take code, copy it from here, and paste it right into the Cloud Shell. And I'm just going to refresh this real fast so it refreshes. Now, what we're going to do here, if you choose to do it through the browser, is you can use SQL CMD, and we'll use the Azure Cloud Shell. And the Azure Cloud Shell is a way that you can access the Azure CLI and Azure PowerShell from wherever you are. It's already pre-installed and up to date. So that can
Hey,
be
Anna, while you're
something-
doing that, I have a question for you while I'm waiting for that.
Yeah,
so
sure.
how much is this going to cost me if I go do this in my Azure subscription? How much do I have to pay for this?
Oh yeah, if you want to go do the
Sandbox
exercises.
Yeah, how much does it cost me?
Free.
It's free.
Yeah, so that's a great point.
This is all free. Okay.
Yeah,
cool.
it's free and really easy to get started and use. So definitely go get hands-on after this. So what I want to show you is now that I'm connected using SQL CMD, this exercise is going to take you through some of those steps to actually load data. So I'm going to move kind of fast because I'm going to assume a lot of you are familiar with this sort of thing, but know that you can go deeper later if you want. But what we're going to first do is we're going to create a schema. So this is pretty standard. You create a schema, and then we're going to create a master key. So I'm going to go ahead and create this master key, and I can use that master key to create a database scoped credential. And what this is going to do is basically allow me to use a shared access signature, which is basically a way to use a token to get access to a blob storage account. And in this blob storage account is the data that we want to load in here. So I'm just going to go ahead and run that over here. And now once we have a database scope credential, we can create an external data source. So I'm just going to call it data set. And again, we're going kind of fast here, but I just want to show you how easy it is to use this Azure Cloud Shell, this sandbox, and how we've built some pretty cool labs. And finally, once I've done that, I can go ahead and kick off the bulk insert. And now while that's running, I just wanted to call out a few things that you might recognize from your experience working with SQL Server and managing performance. So a few things that apply. You can set no count to on. And basically what this does is it reduces the network traffic by stopping like the message that shows the number of rows that are affected. You can also do some things. Let's see, what are some things we're doing? We're using tab lock to minimize the number of log records for the insert operation, and we're also using batching. So batching and inserting in batches is going to help us in reducing the network traffic. Of course, there are other performance tips that apply here. We're going to talk a lot more about performance 2 weeks from now, but just wanted to give you a brief example of this. Now this is still running, but once it runs, we'll just give it one more second to run. Once it runs, we'll hopefully see that we added, about 3 million rows. So I'll just give that 2 more seconds. Now, while that's completing, I actually had one more demo, Bob. I thought maybe it'd be cool to do a back-to-back demo before we wrap up the session. What do you think? Are people up for it?
We said we were going to do demos, so let's see it.
Let's see it. Okay, so I'm going to go back into that VM. Looks like this is still running, unfortunately. But what I have here is I have a managed instance. Now remember, in Azure SQL Managed Instance, you can restore natively. So what I can do is just select restore. And for device, the main difference is that instead of connecting to, let me just see if I need to verify this. Oh, looks like we're going to get in. Instead of connecting to the local file system, I actually need to connect to a storage account that I have in Azure. And so in this case, I can go into the Contoso blob container and create a credential. Now notice all the things I just did here is what we did in SQL CMD pretty much just a moment ago. So now we're going to create access, this shared access signature, similar token. And then once we're in the container, we can navigate, for example, to this backup file, select the backup file. It's going to do a basic some scan and some restore plans, and then it's going to go ahead and allow us to do this restore natively. So this will take just a few seconds. Let me just pop over here. It looks like our load did complete. So just to finish out the demo, so you're not left wondering about it, we can see that we were able to insert almost about 3 million rows just from a data file. And you can actually set this up to read multiple from a single file. And this will take just a few moments to complete. Just for time, we're going to go back. But you can see it's pretty easy to do a lot of things you did in SQL Server before now in Azure SQL.
So I'm really impressed, Anna. 2 demos. You did demos in parallel. That's very impressive.
Yeah. Parallel or crazy, who's
but real quick, that last demo you did you just restore a database from SQL Server right into managed instance? Is that what you're doing?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Exactly.
That's great. That's a great story.
Yeah, very cool. Okay, so we're gonna go a little quick through these last few questions. This first question should be easy. You just saw it, we talked about it. Which Azure SQL deployment options support natively for storing a database? So your options are SQL in Azure VM, Azure SQL Managed Instance, Azure SQL Database, and a combination, which is D, which is SQL Server on VM, and Azure SQL Managed Instance. Let's see, looks like we already have a few votes coming in. Bob, just for time, why don't you go ahead and start taking us through this one?
Well, sure, it can't be C. We just said, you can't restore it. You told us you can't restore natively to Azure SQL Database, so you can eliminate that. And the fact that you can do it for MI and for VM must mean D has to be the answer.
Yep, so that's an easy one. Looks like all the answers we have come in to this point were D, so looks like people have got that one pretty down packed. Okay, we're gonna do another one. So we've gotten near the end, we're doing question after question, demo after demo, getting kind of crazy. But this next question,
baby.
Yeah,
way to roll.
Hyper focus. So this next one is should also be hopefully one that you all can get pretty easily, but this one is, what is not an example of how you can more efficiently load data into Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance? So think about this question. This question, again, this is one of the not questions you'll learn throughout the series. I like to use those questions.
Typical
so
professor.
Yeah.
Throw your students off. Yep, seen that before. Mm-hmm.
Again, Bob, we got some people coming in with some answers. Looks like a few people have said all of the above, and a few people have said simple recovery mode.
Well, all of the above will help, but you said not. So it can't be D. And we said column store indexes and batches will help, but you said not. So simple recovery is the only possible option. And we did emphasize that. Minimal logging is not supported. Can't use simple recovery with Azure SQL. And by the way, there's a very good reason. In order to meet our service level agreements that you're going to want, we can't allow simple recovery databases. If you need that, you need to go to a SQL Server in Azure VM.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome.
Anna, they made it through all your questions. That's
they made
impressive.
It. All the questions, all the demos.
Think about what we just talked about. We did do a lot. We really stepped up the game last week. Everybody liked the intro, but I hate to tell you guys. I mean, if you like this is great, because guess what? The next 3 after this are going to be even more hyper focusedness than this. But real quick here, hey, we talked about how to plan your options, your service tier, your core choices. We talked about how that can impact your resource limits. We talked about migration. We talked about new experiences we've even just launched. We talked about Ignite. Anna showed you a really great demonstration of how to easily deploy with the portal. But hey, CLI and templates and PowerShell are all there to have that same experience. We even showed you what options you pick along the way. We gave you methods to connect and verify your deployment. We went over exhaustingly all different types of configuration options you have as compared to SQL Server, including options to connect to your deployment, and then a great demonstration of what are the different data loading options you have, because that's something you're going to do right out of the gate. We pick loading data as the last part of this module because we knew you would deploy, configure, and need to get data in your deployment. So it was a great session, Anna. Thanks for participating with me today as well. I really enjoyed it today.
Yeah, it's been a fun, information-packed session. As always, we have lots of resources for you. The top one there is this Microsoft Learn Learning Path, which you just saw, where you can do all these exercises for free. We also have 2 books. Bob wrote a book last year on Azure SQL, and myself and a few other PMs wrote a book on developing with Azure SQL Database. So lots of resources out there. Lots of videos out there. If you want to go dive deep into this specific module, you can check it out at this AKA up on the screen here. So again, this is what we went through today. This is all the demos we did today. You can get hands-on with them here. And, mark your calendar. Every Monday, same time, same place you were here today. We've done 2 weeks, but we still have 4 more, right, Bob?
Yeah, think about what we did. We showed you what it's about. We showed how to deploy and configure. Why not go learn in the next few weeks? Pick your choice here. Why know how to secure it, how to get best performance out of it, and how to make it highly available, and then wrap it all up with a great session about putting it all together. I'm looking forward, Anna, to the next 4 weeks together with you.
Yeah, I am as well. And I hope, all our viewers are sure to tune in, like, subscribe, come join us next week. We're really excited about it. And thanks for joining us on Learn Live.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.